Good evening. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of ancient Alexandria, where the scent of incense mingles with the whispers of conspiracy, and where one woman wielded power so absolute, so calculated, that empires trembled at her word. History remembers Cleopatra the Seventh as the beautiful seductress who charmed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but this is the story they don't want you to know. This is the story of how Cleopatra's true weapon wasn't her beauty, it was her mind. A mind so sharp, so strategically brilliant, that she played the most powerful men of her era like pieces on a chessboard, manipulating the fate of nations with nothing more than her intellect and an iron will to survive. Before we descend into the marble halls where pharaohs plotted and kingdoms fell, tell me in the comments, from which corner of the empire are you watching tonight? Is it the quiet hours before dawn, when secrets are whispered in palaces, or perhaps the golden hour of dusk, when empires cast their longest shadows? And if you're ready to unlock the forbidden strategies of history's most dangerous rulers, subscribe now, because in the deadly game of ancient politics, knowledge isn't just power, it's survival. Tonight, you'll discover why Cleopatra wasn't just the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was the last great player in a game that had been centuries in the making. A game where one wrong move meant death, and where she not only survived, but thrived for nearly 2 decades. This is the story of the most dangerous woman who ever lived. The year is 51 BCE. In the great library of Alexandria, scrolls containing the wisdom of centuries line marble shelves that stretch toward heaven itself. But wisdom, as young Cleopatra VII is about to learn, means nothing without the power to wield it. At 18, she finds herself thrust onto the throne of Egypt alongside her 10-year-old brother. Ptolemy XIII, according to their father's will. To the outside world, this might seem like a traditional rulership, but Cleopatra knows better. She knows that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, sharing power is just another word for civil war. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Ever since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I, claimed the ancient kingdom as his prize. But theirs was a dynasty built on a foundation of paranoia and bloodshed. Brothers murdered sisters, mothers poisoned sons, children orchestrated the deaths of their own parents. It was a family tree watered with poison and pruned with daggers. And Cleopatra, brilliant beyond her years, understood that she had been born into a world where love was weakness and trust was a luxury that meant death. But here's what made Cleopatra different from every other Ptolemaic ruler who came before her. While her ancestors had focused their attention on the marble corridors of Alexandria, treating Egypt as nothing more than a golden goose to be plucked, Cleopatra looked beyond the palace walls. She saw something they had all missed. Egypt wasn't just a kingdom to be ruled. It was a people to be understood, a culture to be embraced, and most importantly, a force to be unleashed. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to learn Egyptian. Think about that for a moment. For 300 years, the royal family of Egypt couldn't even speak to their own subjects. They remained isolated in their Greek bubble, growing weaker with each generation, more dependent on Rome, more vulnerable to internal rebellion. But Cleopatra, she saw the writing on the wall, quite literally. She could read the hieroglyphs that covered every temple, every monument, every sacred site in her kingdom. And in doing so, she didn't just learn a language, she learned the soul of Egypt itself. This wasn't just about communication. This was about power in its purest form. When Cleopatra spoke to the high priests of Memphis in their own tongue, when she participated in sacred ceremonies that her ancestors had ignored, when she presented herself not just as a Greek conqueror, but as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, she wasn't just playing politics. She was rewriting the rules of the game entirely. The young queen understood something that would define her entire reign. Image isn't just important, it's everything. And she was about to prove that she could craft an image so powerful, so compelling, that it would seduce not just kings and generals, but entire populations. The girl who walked into that throne room in 51 BCE was about to become the most dangerous political animal the ancient world had ever seen. But first, she had to survive her own family. By 48 BCE, the inevitable had happened. The Cold War between Cleopatra and her brother husband Ptolemy XIII had erupted into open conflict. This wasn't a family squabble, this was a fight for survival, and in the Ptolemaic family, there were no rules except one: winner takes all, loser takes nothing, including their life. Ptolemy XIII, though still a child, was backed by the most powerful faction in Alexandria, the Regency Council led by the cunning eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetoric teacher Apollo. These men saw in the boy pharaoh a puppet they could control, a weak vessel through which they could exercise real power. Cleopatra, brilliant and sprittled, represented everything they feared: a ruler who couldn't be controlled, manipulated, or intimidated. The civil war that followed was swift and brutal. Cleopatra's forces were defeated, and she was forced to flee Egypt entirely, escaping to Syria with a small band of loyal followers. For most rulers, this would have been the end. Exile meant irrelevance, and irrelevance in the ancient world meant death, if not immediately, then eventually. But Cleopatra wasn't most rulers. While in exile, she did something extraordinary. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or plotting desperate revenge, she analyzed every aspect of her defeat, every miscalculation that had led to her downfall, and she identified the fatal flaw in her strategy. She had been playing a local game when she should have been playing a global one. Egypt might be rich, Egypt might be ancient, but Egypt was no longer the center of the world. Rome was. This realization would transform Cleopatra from a brilliant local player into a master of international politics. She understood that the key to Egyptian independence wasn't to resist Roman influence, but to manipulate it, to use Rome's own strength against itself, to play the great Roman leaders against each other while positioning herself as the indispensable ally to whoever emerged victorious. But first, she needed to get back into Egypt, and that's when Cleopatra pulled off one of the most audacious gambits in political history. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey in the Roman Civil War. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, eager to curry favor with what they believed would be the winning side, murdered Pompey and presented his head to Caesar as a gift. They expected gratitude. Instead, they got disgust. Caesar may have been Pompey's enemy, but Pompey had been a Roman consul, a man of honor. This crude assassination was beneath Roman dignity. Cleopatra saw her opening. While her brother's advisors were congratulating themselves on their political masterstroke, she was planning something far more sophisticated. She knew that Caesar was isolated in Alexandria, cut off from his fleet, surrounded by hostile forces. She also knew that he was a man who appreciated intelligence, courage, and above all, dramatic flair. So she did something that has become the stuff of legend, but which, at the time, was pure, calculated risk. She had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, wrapped in a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled, there she was, not the broken exile her enemies expected, but a queen in full regalia, speaking perfect Latin, presenting herself not as a supplicant begging for help, but as an equal offering alliance. But here's what the romantic versions of this story always miss. This wasn't about seduction in any conventional sense. This was about power, recognizing power. Caesar, one of the most brilliant political minds in history, looked at this young woman and saw something he rarely encountered, a worthy partner in the great game of empire. What followed wasn't a love affair, it was a political alliance disguised as a love affair, and that distinction would prove to be crucial. The alliance between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar was more than romantic theatre. It was a masterclass in political symbiosis. Both rulers understood that they needed each other, but for very different reasons. Caesar needed Egyptian gold to fund his civil war against the Roman Senate. Cleopatra needed Roman military might to secure her throne. But what made their partnership so dangerous wasn't what they gave each other, it was what they learned from each other. From Caesar, Cleopatra absorbed the brutal pragmatism of Roman politics. She watched him navigate the treacherous waters of the Roman civil war, making allies of enemies, breaking oaths when convenient, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. Caesar showed her that mercy was often just weakness disguised as virtue, and that sometimes the most effective way to handle opposition wasn't to defeat it, but to seduce it. But Caesar learned things from Cleopatra too. He saw how she wielded divine authority, how she made herself not just a political leader, but a religious icon. In Egypt, pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods. And Caesar, who would later declare himself dictator for life and demand divine honors, was taking careful notes. The Alexandrian war that followed was swift and decisive. Ptolemy XIII's forces, despite their initial advantage, couldn't compete with the combined might of Roman military precision and Egyptian resources. Achilles was killed in battle. Parthenos was executed on Caesar's orders, and young Ptolemy XIII met his end in the Nile. Whether by accident or design, no one could say for certain. But Cleopatra's victory came with a price. She was now unquestionably the ruler of Egypt, but she was also unquestionably dependent on Rome. This was a dangerous position, and she knew it. History was littered with client kings who had outlived their usefulness to Rome and found themselves replaced by more compliant alternatives. She needed to make herself indispensable, not just to Caesar, but to Rome itself. Her solution was brilliant in its audacity. Instead of trying to hide Egypt's dependence on Rome, she would make Rome dependent on Egypt. But not through military might. Egypt couldn't match Roman legions. Instead, she would do it through something far more subtle and far more permanent: culture, luxury, and the kind of soft power that seeps into a civilization's soul and changes it from within. When Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE, he brought Cleopatra with him. To the Roman people, she was introduced as an ally, a fellow ruler, a living symbol of Egypt's submission to Roman authority. But that wasn't how Cleopatra saw herself. She saw herself as a conqueror, and Rome was her target. The Romans had always prided themselves on their austerity, their simplicity, their rejection of Eastern decadence. But when Cleopatra arrived in Rome, she brought with her a glimpse of a different world, a world of unimaginable luxury, of art that took the breath away, of knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. She lived in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber, and that villa became the most sought-after invitation in the city. Roman senators who had spent their careers denouncing Eastern excess found themselves mesmerized by Egyptian philosophers. Roman matrons who had built their identities around modest republican virtues found themselves studying Cleopatra's cosmetics, her jewelry, her fashion. Even Roman intellectuals, supposedly immune to such frivolities, were drawn to the Egyptian queen's encyclopedic knowledge of literature, mathematics, and natural philosophy. This was cultural warfare at its most sophisticated. Cleopatra wasn't trying to conquer Rome through military force. She was trying to conquer it through seduction. Not sexual seduction, though that was part of it, but intellectual and aesthetic seduction. She was showing Rome a version of itself that was more sophisticated, more refined, more powerful than anything the Republic had ever produced. And it was working. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra wasn't just tolerated by the Roman elite, it was envied. Here was proof that Rome's greatest general, the conqueror of Gaul, had himself been conquered by something greater than military might. He had been conquered by civilization itself. But then came the Ides of March, 44 BCE, and everything changed. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15, 44 BCE, was more than the death of a dictator. It was the shattering of Cleopatra's entire strategy. In one brutal morning, the man who had made her the most powerful woman in the world was reduced to a bloody corpse on the Senate floor. And she found herself stranded in a Rome that suddenly saw her not as an exotic ally, but as a dangerous foreign influence that needed to be eliminated. The conspirators who killed Caesar thought they were restoring the Roman Republic. In reality, they had just guaranteed that the Republic would never recover. But that was a problem for later. Cleopatra's immediate concern was survival. She was pregnant with Caesar's son, Caesarion, living in a city that had just witnessed the violent rejection of everything Caesar represented. Every day she remained in Rome was another day closer to her own assassination. So she did what she did best. She adapted. Within weeks of Caesar's murder, Cleopatra had quietly slipped out of Rome and made her way back to Egypt. But she didn't slink away in defeat. She left as a queen returning to her kingdom, carrying with her something more valuable than gold: Caesar's heir. Caesarion would become Cleopatra's insurance policy and her ultimate gambit, a boy who carried both Egyptian royal blood and Caesar's legacy. He represented the possibility of a future where East and West weren't just allied, but unified under a single crown. It was an audacious vision, one that would require decades to realize, and one that would put her on a collision course with every major power in the Roman world. But first, she had to navigate the chaos that followed Caesar's death. Rome exploded into civil war, with multiple factions claiming to represent Caesar's true legacy. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, controlled much of the army. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, controlled his name and his political networks. The old Republican faction, led by men like Cicero, controlled the Senate. And in the East, Caesar's assassins Brutus and Cassius were raising their own armies, claiming to fight for the restoration of Republican virtue. For most rulers, this would have been an impossible situation to navigate. Supporting any one faction meant making enemies of all the others. But Cleopatra saw opportunity where others saw only danger. A divided Rome was a Rome that needed allies, and Egypt was the richest, most stable kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean. She played all sides with masterful precision. When the triumvirate of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus was formed in 43 BCE, she offered support. When Brutus and Cassius demanded Egyptian aid for their campaign, she promised it but delivered nothing. When various Roman commanders sought sanctuary in Egypt, she welcomed them with open arms and open ears, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable in the years to come. But Cleopatra's masterstroke during this period wasn't political, it was personal. She recognized that the key to Egypt's future lay not in backing the winner of Rome's civil wars, but in making sure that whoever won would need her more than she needed them. And she identified the perfect target for this strategy: Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony. Antony was everything Caesar had been, but more so. Where Caesar had been calculating, Antony was passionate. Where Caesar had been disciplined, Antony was indulgent. Where Caesar had maintained the fiction of republican government, Antony dreamed openly of Eastern-style monarchy. He was powerful, charismatic, and completely predictable. In other words, he was perfect. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. He expected a tribute-paying client queen, nervous and subservient. What he got was one of the most spectacular displays of soft power in ancient history. Cleopatra arrived dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, aboard a barge that seemed to have sailed straight out of mythology. The sails were purple silk, the oars were silver, and the entire vessel was scented with perfumes. So intoxicating that crowds gathered on the riverbanks just to breathe the air. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, fanned by boys dressed as cupids, attended by servants costumed as sea nymphs and graces. But this wasn't just theatre, though it was certainly that. This was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of Egyptian wealth, Egyptian sophistication, and Egyptian power. Every detail had been calculated to produce a specific effect. Antony had summoned a subject, but what arrived was a goddess. And when a goddess invites you to dinner, you don't refuse. The banquet that followed was legendary even by ancient standards. Tables groaned under delicacies from every corner of the known world. Wine flowed from golden cups encrusted with gems. Entertainment was provided by the finest musicians, dancers, and performers money could buy. But the real performance was Cleopatra herself, displaying a level of cultural sophistication that made even Rome's greatest general feel like a provincial. By the end of that evening, Antony wasn't just charmed, he was conquered. But so was Cleopatra, though not in the way most people think. She had found her perfect partner, a man powerful enough to protect Egypt's independence, pliable enough to be guided, and ambitious enough to dream of something greater than mere Roman supremacy. What followed would be 13 years of the most dangerous political partnership in ancient history. The relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony wasn't just a love affair. It was the birth of an alternative vision for the ancient world. While Octavian was consolidating power in Rome, preaching the virtues of traditional Roman values and republican restoration, Antony and Cleopatra were creating something entirely new, a fusion of East and West that promised to remake the Mediterranean world. Their first years together were a careful dance of political calculation disguised as romantic indulgence. Antony needed Egyptian resources to secure his position in the eastern provinces. Cleopatra needed Roman military protection to ensure her dynasty's survival. But what made their alliance so dangerous wasn't what they needed from each other, it was what they dreamed of together. In 37 BCE, they formalized their union through marriage. Though by Roman law, Antony was still married to Octavian's sister, Octavia. This wasn't just bigamy, it was a declaration of independence from Roman authority. Antony was announcing to the world that he no longer considered himself bound by Roman law, Roman customs, or Roman limitations. He was becoming something new. Neither fully Roman nor Egyptian, but both and more. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theatre. Combining Roman gravitas with Egyptian mysticism, it presented the couple not just as lovers, but as divine representatives of a new world order. Antony was declared the new Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection. Cleopatra was proclaimed the new Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood. Together, they would rule not just Egypt and Rome's eastern provinces, but the entire civilized world. This wasn't mere grandiosity. It was a carefully crafted alternative to the Roman imperial system that was emerging under Octavian. Where Octavian offered order through uniformity, Antony and Cleopatra offered prosperity through diversity. Where Octavian promised peace through Roman dominance, they promised harmony through cultural fusion. The kingdom they began to build reflected this vision. Alexandria became not just the capital of Egypt, but the cultural center of the Eastern Mediterranean. The great library was expanded and revitalized. Scholars, artists, and philosophers from across the known world flocked to a court that offered both intellectual freedom and unlimited patronage. The city became a showcase of what the world could look like under enlightened rule. But Cleopatra's masterstroke wasn't just cultural, it was dynastic. By 33 BCE, she had borne Antony 3 children, the twins Alexander, Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy, Philadelphus. Combined with Caesarion, Caesar's son, she now had 4 children who could claim descent from both Egyptian royalty and Roman nobility. She was creating a generation that could legitimately rule both East and West. The ceremony, known as the Donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, represented the culmination of this strategy. In a spectacular public celebration, Antony formally granted vast territories to Cleopatra and her children. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings, joint ruler of Egypt with his mother. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and all territories east of the Euphrates. Cleopatra, Selina, was granted Cyrenaica and Libya. Young Ptolemy, Philadelphus, received Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. To Roman eyes, this was outrageous. A Roman general was giving away Roman conquests to foreign royalty. But to Eastern eyes, it was inspired. Here was a vision of empire that respected local traditions, promoted regional autonomy, and offered advancement based on merit rather than birthplace. It was everything Rome wasn't, and that's exactly what made it so appealing. The wealth that flowed into this new kingdom was staggering. Egypt's grain fed much of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian gold funded armies and public works across the region. Egyptian trade networks connected India with Athens, Britain with Arabia. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that this alternative vision of empire might actually work. But Cleopatra and Antony had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that Octavian, focused on consolidating power in Rome and the western provinces, would be content to let them rule the East as they saw fit. They had forgotten that shared power was an alien concept to Roman political thinking. In the Roman mind, there could be only one master of the Mediterranean world, and that master would be determined not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through war. The conflict that was brewing would determine not just the fate of Egypt, but the future of Western civilization itself. Before the first sword was drawn, before the first ship set sail, the real battle between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra was fought with words, images, and ideas. This was propaganda warfare at its most sophisticated, and in this contest of narratives, Cleopatra found herself facing an opponent who understood the power of perception every bit as well as she did. Octavian's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He couldn't attack Antony directly, not initially. Antony was still a Roman citizen, a fellow triumvir, a man who had served the Republic with distinction. So instead, Octavian attacked Cleopatra, portraying her as the real power behind the Eastern alliance. The foreign seductress who had corrupted a noble Roman and turned him into a puppet of Egyptian ambition. The propaganda campaign that followed would become the template for character assassination throughout history. Cleopatra was depicted as a witch who used dark magic to control men's minds. She was described as a drunkard who spent her days in debauchery while her people suffered. She was portrayed as a sexual deviant who corrupted everything she touched. Most damaging of all, she was presented as an existential threat to Roman civilization itself. A barbarian queen who sought to reduce the eternal city to a mere province of an Egyptian empire. None of this was true, of course, but truth was irrelevant. What mattered was creating a narrative that Romans could understand and fear. And the narrative Octavian created was perfect. The noble Roman Republic, defended by Augustus Caesar's heir, against the decadent Eastern monarchy, led by a foreign queen who represented everything Romans despised about the wider world. Cleopatra's response revealed both her strengths and her limitations as a political operator. She understood propaganda, but she understood it as an Egyptian queen, not as a Roman politician. Her counter-narrative focused on legitimacy, divinity, and cultural superiority. She presented herself as the heir to Alexander the Great, the descendant of the pharaohs, the living embodiment of ancient wisdom. She emphasized her children's mixed heritage, their claims to both Eastern and Western authority. In the Eastern Mediterranean, this message resonated powerfully. But in Rome itself, it only confirmed everything Octavian was saying about her foreign nature and imperial ambitions. Cleopatra was fighting a Roman propaganda war with Egyptian weapons, and that mismatch would prove catastrophic. The turning point came in 32 BCE, when Octavian somehow obtained a copy of Antony's will. Whether it was stolen, leaked, or forged remains unclear, but the document contained explosive revelations. According to Octavian's reading, Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, had acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate heir, and had left vast bequests to his children by Cleopatra. When Octavian read the will before the Roman Senate, the reaction was explosive. Here was proof, seemingly in Antony's own hand, that he had abandoned not just Roman law, but Roman identity itself. He had become, in the eyes of his countrymen, more Egyptian than Roman. The Senate voted to strip Antony of his powers and declare war on Cleopatra. Notably, they declared war on Cleopatra, not on Antony. This wasn't an accident. By framing the conflict as Rome versus Egypt rather than Roman versus Roman, Octavian avoided the stigma of civil war while positioning himself as the defender of Roman civilization against foreign aggression. It was a masterful piece of political theater, and it guaranteed that when the fighting started, public opinion would be firmly on Octavian's side. But propaganda wars aren't won just through words, they're won through actions. And the actions that Cleopatra and Antony took in response to Octavian's declaration of war would determine not just the outcome of the conflict, but how history would remember them. By 31 BCE, the Mediterranean world balanced on the edge of a knife. Two visions of empire, two concepts of civilization, two definitions of power stood ready to clash in what everyone understood would be a final, decisive confrontation. On one side, Octavian commanded the loyalty of Rome and the western provinces, backed by the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. On the other, Antony and Cleopatra controlled the wealthy eastern kingdoms, supported by the accumulated treasures of centuries and the naval traditions of the ancient world. But this wasn't just a military conflict. It was a battle for the soul of Western civilization. And Cleopatra found herself at the center of forces that would determine the course of history for the next 1,000 years. The preparations for war revealed the fundamental differences between the two sides. Octavian's forces were disciplined, uniform, motivated by Roman ideals of duty and sacrifice. They saw themselves as defenders of tradition, protectors of the Republic, inheritors of the virtues that had made Rome great. Their equipment was practical, their tactics proven, their loyalty absolute. Cleopatra and Antony's forces were magnificent, diverse, and fatally divided. The army they assembled for the final campaign was like nothing the ancient world had ever seen. Roman legions fighting alongside Egyptian phalanxes, Gallic cavalry charging with Arabian archers, Germanic warriors serving under Nubian commanders. It was a preview of the multicultural empire they dreamed of creating. But it was also a logistical nightmare held together by little more than personal loyalty to their commanders. The naval forces tell the same story. Octavian's fleet was built for war, fast and maneuverable, crewed by experienced sailors who had spent years perfecting their tactics. Cleopatra's contribution to the Allied fleet was breathtaking but impractical. Massive galleys that looked like floating palaces, decorated with gold and precious stones, carrying treasures worth more than entire kingdoms. They were symbols of Egyptian wealth and power, but they were also slow, unwieldy, and impossible to replace. The campaign began with both sides maneuvering for position, seeking the perfect moment to strike the decisive blow. Antony, drawing on decades of military experience, wanted to fight on land, where his veteran legions could crush Octavian's forces through superior numbers and experience. But Cleopatra convinced him that naval warfare offered better opportunities, arguing that control of the sea would allow them to strangle Octavian's supply lines while keeping their own Egyptian resources secure. It was a logical argument, but it was also a fatal mistake. By choosing to fight at sea, Cleopatra and Antony were playing to Octavian's strengths while abandoning their own. Roman naval technology had evolved rapidly during the civil wars, while Egyptian shipbuilding had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. More importantly, they were giving Octavian exactly the kind of dramatic, decisive battle that would allow him to end the war with a single stroke. The fleets met at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, what happened next has been debated by historians for over 2,000 years. But the basic facts are clear. The battle began at dawn, with both fleets arranged in traditional formation. For hours, the outcome remained in doubt, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Then, suddenly, Cleopatra's squadron broke from the battle line and sailed away. Whether this was a planned retreat, a tactical withdrawal, or simple panic remains unclear. But the effect was immediate and devastating. When the Egyptian ships fled, Antony followed them, abandoning his own fleet and army to chase after the woman he loved. To the soldiers watching from both sides, the message was unmistakable. Antony had chosen Cleopatra over Rome, personal desire over duty, Eastern decadence over Roman virtue. The psychological impact was even more destructive than the military defeat. Antony's remaining forces, demoralized and leaderless, began to surrender in droves. But here's what most accounts of Actium miss. Cleopatra's flight might not have been cowardice. It might have been calculation. She had brought the Egyptian treasury to the battle, intending to use it to fund the long campaign. When she realized that the battle was lost, she may have decided that preserving that wealth was more important than preserving her honor. Dead heroes can't rebuild kingdoms, but living rulers with full treasuries can. If that was her plan, it failed. The flight from Actium destroyed more than her fleet. It destroyed her reputation. From that moment forward, she would be remembered not as the brilliant strategist who had outmaneuvered Rome for 2 decades, but as the coward who fled at the first sign of real danger. It was a narrative that would define her legacy for millennia, and it was largely her own creation. But Cleopatra wasn't finished. Even in defeat, she was planning her next move. And what she did next would be both her greatest triumph and her final tragedy. The months following Actium were perhaps the most dangerous of Cleopatra's entire reign. Cut off from her allies, abandoned by most of her supporters, facing the inevitable Roman invasion of Egypt. She could have chosen surrender, exile, or suicide. Instead, she chose something far more audacious. She decided to seduce Octavian. This wasn't the desperate gambit of a defeated queen. This was the calculated strategy of a woman who understood that her greatest weapon had never been her beauty, but her ability to make herself indispensable to whoever held power. She had done it with Caesar, turning a military alliance into a political partnership that lasted until his death. She had done it with Antony, transforming a tribute meeting into a 13-year reign over the Eastern Mediterranean. Now she would attempt the same transformation with the man who had destroyed everything she had built. The plan was brilliant in its audacity. Cleopatra knew that Octavian faced the same challenge that had confronted every Roman leader since Pompey: how to govern the East. Roman administration worked well in Europe, where local cultures could be absorbed or eliminated. But the Eastern Mediterranean was different. Here were civilizations older than Rome itself, religious traditions that predated the Republic, trade networks that connected 3 continents. You couldn't govern this region through force alone. You needed legitimacy, and legitimacy in the East meant Egyptian support. Cleopatra also understood Octavian better than he understood himself. She recognized that beneath his propaganda about republican virtue and traditional values lay the same imperial ambitions that had driven Caesar and Antony. Octavian wanted to be emperor, but he needed to appear reluctant. He wanted absolute power, but he needed to seem modest. He wanted divine honors, but he needed to maintain the fiction of serving the state. Egypt could give him all of this. As Pharaoh of Egypt, he could be a god-king without offending Roman sensibilities. As Cleopatra's partner, he could claim legitimacy stretching back to Alexander the Great. As ruler of the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, he could fund the transformation of Rome from republic to empire without raising taxes on Roman citizens. The negotiations that followed Antony's suicide in August 30th BCE were conducted with all the subtlety and sophistication that had marked Cleopatra's entire career. She couldn't offer Octavian military alliance. Her forces were destroyed. She couldn't offer him political support. Her reputation was in ruins. But she could offer him something more valuable than armies or votes. She could offer him Egypt itself, the greatest prize in the ancient world, handed over not through conquest, but through marriage. For a brief moment, it seemed like the gambit might work. Octavian was intrigued by the woman who had captivated both Caesar and Antony. He was impressed by her intelligence, her knowledge, her ability to discuss philosophy, mathematics, and literature with equal expertise. Most importantly, he was tempted by what she represented: the chance to achieve through negotiation what would otherwise require years of costly and uncertain warfare. But Octavian was also something that neither Caesar nor Antony had been: completely immune to the kind of personal charm that Cleopatra wielded so effectively. Where Caesar had been impressed by her audacity and Antony had been swept away by her passion, Octavian saw only a tactical problem to be solved. He didn't want a partner in empire. He wanted total control. And as long as Cleopatra lived, as long as Caesarion lived, as long as the Ptolemaic dynasty continued, there would always be an alternative center of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The final meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian was a masterpiece of political theater on both sides. She appeared as she always had in such moments, magnificently dressed, intellectually formidable, projecting an aura of divine authority even in defeat. He received her with the courtesy due to a fellow ruler, but with the coldness of a man who had already made his decision. The conversation that followed has been reconstructed by historians based on later accounts, but the essential points are clear. Cleopatra offered Octavian everything: her kingdom, her treasure, her knowledge, herself. She painted a vision of an empire that would stretch from Britain to India, ruled not through force but through wisdom, prosperity, and cultural synthesis. She promised him legitimacy that no Roman had ever possessed, divinity that no conquest could provide, and wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. Octavian listened, weighed her words, and rejected them all, not because he didn't want what she offered, but because he understood that accepting it would mean sharing power. And Octavian, unlike his predecessors, was not a man who shared anything. The refusal was delivered with Roman directness. There would be no marriage, no alliance, no partnership. Egypt would become a Roman province, governed by Roman officials according to Roman law. The Ptolemaic dynasty would end, Caesarion would die, and Cleopatra herself would be taken to Rome, where she would walk in chains behind Octavian's triumph before being ritually strangled in the Mamertine prison. It was at this moment that Cleopatra revealed the steel that had always lurked beneath her diplomatic sophistication. She had spent her entire adult life outmaneuvering the most powerful men of her age, and she was not about to let some cold-blooded young Roman dictate the terms of her exit from the stage of history. If she could not live as a queen, she would at least die as one. The death of Cleopatra on August 30th, 30 BCE, was her last and perhaps greatest political act. Even in defeat, even facing the complete destruction of everything she had built, she managed to seize control of her own narrative and transform a military catastrophe into a cultural victory that would resonate through the ages. The popular image of Cleopatra's suicide, a beautiful woman dramatically expiring from the bite of an asp, is almost certainly a romanticized fiction. The reality was both more complex and more characteristic of the woman who had spent 2 decades manipulating the perceptions of kings and commoners alike. Cleopatra understood that how she died would determine how she was remembered, and she was determined to stage manage her own legend. The preparations for suicide began days before the act itself. Cleopatra dismissed most of her servants, keeping only her most trusted companions, Iris, her hairdresser, and Charmian, her secretary and confidant. These women had served her for decades, had witnessed her greatest triumphs and her most intimate moments. If anyone could be trusted to carry out her final wishes, it was them. The location chosen for the suicide was carefully selected: Cleopatra's private mausoleum, which she had been constructing for years as her intended final resting place. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis, designed to demonstrate her divine nature even in death. The building itself was a masterpiece of Egyptian architecture, combining traditional pharaonic imagery with Hellenistic sophistication and Roman grandeur. But the most important element of Cleopatra's death wasn't the location or the method, it was the message. Through her suicide, she was making a statement that would echo through history: that some things are more valuable than life itself, that dignity matters more than survival, that it is better to die as a free queen than to live as a captive symbol of Roman triumph. The method of suicide she chose was almost certainly not the dramatic snakebite of popular legend. Modern historians believe she most likely used a cocktail of poisons, carefully prepared to ensure a quick and relatively painless death. The asp story, dramatic though it is, was probably invented later to add symbolic weight to her death. In Egyptian mythology, the cobra was associated with divine kingship and was worn on the pharaoh's crown as a symbol of protection. By claiming that she died from a cobra's bite, Later, chroniclers were suggesting that she died as she had lived, as a goddess queen of Egypt. But the real genius of Cleopatra's final act wasn't in the staging, it was in the timing. She chose to die at the moment when Roman forces were preparing to enter Alexandria, when her capture was imminent but not yet accomplished. This timing accomplished several crucial objectives. It denied Octavian the trophy he most desired, the chance to parade the last pharaoh of Egypt through the streets of Rome in chains. It prevented the humiliation that would have destroyed her legend and reduced her to a footnote in Roman history. And it preserved her image as an independent ruler who bowed to no one, not even Caesar's heir. The scene in the mausoleum was carefully orchestrated to maximize its emotional and symbolic impact. Cleopatra dressed herself in her finest royal regalia, complete with the golden uraeus serpent crown of the pharaohs. She arranged herself on a golden couch, surrounded by the treasures of her dynasty, positioned to look not like a suicide victim, but like a queen receiving visitors in her throne room. When Iris and Charmian followed their mistress in death, they completed the tableau that Cleopatra had envisioned. Here was loyalty that transcended life itself, devotion that no Roman could understand or duplicate. The message was clear. This was what real power looked like. Not the crude force that Octavian wielded, but the kind of authority that inspired people to die willingly for their leader. When Roman soldiers finally broke into the mausoleum, they found a scene that must have been both breathtaking and terrifying. 3 women, beautifully dressed, peacefully arranged, beyond the reach of Roman justice or Roman vengeance. Octavian had won the war, but Cleopatra had won something more important. She had won immortality. The immediate Roman reaction was a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the last serious threat to Octavian's power had been eliminated without the need for a messy public execution. The frustration that the most spectacular trophy of the Egyptian campaign had slipped through their fingers, but the long-term impact was something no one could have predicted. By choosing death over submission, Cleopatra had transformed herself from a defeated enemy into a tragic heroine. Her suicide became the stuff of legend, inspiring poets, playwrights, and artists for centuries to come. Where a live Cleopatra in Roman chains would have been quickly forgotten, a dead Cleopatra in royal regalia became eternal. In the immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death, it seemed that Octavian had achieved complete victory. Egypt was now a Roman province, governed by his personal representative rather than a traditional senator, ensuring that its vast wealth would flow directly into the imperial treasury. The Ptolemaic dynasty was extinct. With Caesarion murdered on Octavian's orders and Cleopatra's other children either dead or reduced to powerless ornaments in Roman households, the great library of Alexandria would continue to function, but now as an appendage of Roman power rather than an independent center of learning. Yet, even as Octavian celebrated his triumph, the seeds of Cleopatra's eventual victory were already being planted. The story of her life and death proved irresistible to writers, artists, and philosophers throughout the Roman world. Within a generation, she had been transformed from a defeated enemy into a figure of romance and tragedy that captured imaginations across the Mediterranean. This transformation reveals the fundamental miscalculation that underlay Octavian's entire approach to Cleopatra. He had understood her as a political problem to be solved through military force. But Cleopatra was never just a political figure. She was a cultural force, and cultural forces cannot be conquered through conventional warfare. They must be absorbed, transformed, or replaced, and Octavian had done none of these things effectively. The Rome that emerged from the civil wars was a curious hybrid, combining republican traditions with monarchical reality, Roman austerity with Eastern luxury, Latin practicality with Greek philosophy. Much of this synthesis was intentional, the product of Augustus's careful political engineering, but much of it was also the unintended consequence of Rome's encounters with Cleopatra and the civilization she represented. The imperial court that Augustus established borrowed heavily, though often unconsciously, from Ptolemaic precedents. The divine honors that Roman emperors would claim, the ceremonial protocols that surrounded them, the artistic and architectural styles that defined their reigns, all showed the influence of Egyptian royal tradition. Even the title Augustus itself, meaning revered one, echoed the divine kingship that Cleopatra had embodied. More subtly, but more importantly, Rome's relationship with its eastern provinces was forever changed by the Cleopatra episode. The crude exploitation that had characterized earlier Roman expansion gave way to a more sophisticated approach that respected local traditions while incorporating them into a broader imperial framework. This wasn't necessarily because Roman leaders had learned to value diversity for its own sake, but because they had seen what happened when Eastern populations were pushed too far. The cultural impact was even more profound. The literature, art, and philosophy of the early imperial period was saturated with Eastern influences that would have been inconceivable in the austere republic that Cicero had defended. Roman poets wrote about love with a passion that owed more to Alexandrian verse than to traditional Latin poetry. Roman architects incorporated Egyptian obelisks and Greek columns into designs that created entirely new forms of monumental art. Roman philosophers grappled with metaphysical questions that had occupied Egyptian and Mesopotamian thinkers for millennia. In all of this, Cleopatra's influence was rarely acknowledged directly, but it was everywhere present. She had not conquered Rome through military force, but she had conquered it through the much more subtle and durable means of cultural transformation. The Rome that emerged from her defeat was more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, more intellectually curious than the Rome that had declared war on her. It was, in many ways, the kind of synthesis between East and West that she and Antony had dreamed of creating. But perhaps Cleopatra's most lasting victory was in the realm of memory itself. The propaganda war that Octavian had waged so successfully during her lifetime began to backfire almost immediately after her death. The image of Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress proved less durable than the image of Cleopatra as a tragic queen destroyed by forces beyond her control. The process began with Roman writers themselves, historians like Plutarch, while officially supporting the Augustan version of events, couldn't help but admire the woman who had captivated the two greatest Romans of her age. Poets like Horace, despite celebrating Augustus's victory at Actium, wrote about Cleopatra with a mixture of fear and fascination that revealed the complex emotions she continued to inspire. As the centuries passed, the rehabilitation of Cleopatra's reputation accelerated. Christian writers, hostile to both Roman imperialism and pagan religion, found in her story a useful example of worldly power ultimately humbled by divine justice. But they also found in her death a model of noble resistance to tyranny that resonated with their own experiences of persecution. Medieval chroniclers, working with fragmentary sources and guided by literary rather than historical concerns, gradually stripped away the political complexities of Cleopatra's career and focused on its dramatic and romantic elements. The brilliant strategist who had outmaneuvered Rome for 2 decades was replaced by the beautiful queen who had died for love. The Renaissance brought a more complex understanding, as scholars gained access to more ancient sources and developed more sophisticated historical methods. But it also brought new forms of artistic expression that were perfectly suited to Cleopatra's story. Painters could capture her beauty and majesty in ways that written descriptions never could. Playwrights could dramatize her relationships with Caesar and Antony as eternal conflicts between duty and passion, East and West, ancient wisdom and modern ambition. By the time Shakespeare wrote Antony and Cleopatra in the early 17th century, the historical Cleopatra had been almost completely obscured by the legendary one. But paradoxically, this legendary Cleopatra was in some ways truer to the historical figure than the propaganda image that Augustus had tried to establish. Shakespeare's queen was brilliant, passionate, manipulative, and above all, dangerous. Not because of her beauty, but because of her intelligence and will. The true measure of Cleopatra's historical importance isn't found in the monuments she built or the battles she fought, but in the shadow she cast over every powerful woman who came after her. For 2,000 years, female rulers, politicians, and cultural figures have had to navigate the expectations, fears, and fantasies that her story established. She became both an inspiration and a warning, a model of what women could achieve, and a reminder of how dangerous such achievement could be. The Roman empresses who followed Augustus lived in Cleopatra's shadow, whether they acknowledged it or not. Women like Livia, Julia, Agrippina, and Julia Domna wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, but they could never openly claim the kind of independent authority that Cleopatra had exercised. The spectre of the foreign queen who had nearly brought Rome to its knees made any display of feminine ambition suspect, potentially treasonous. This pattern would repeat itself throughout European history. Medieval queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of Castile achieved remarkable things, but always had to be careful not to appear too independent, too ambitious, too much like the legendary Egyptian seductress who had corrupted noble Romans. The threat of being labeled another Cleopatra hung over any woman who dared to exercise power directly rather than through male intermediaries. Even in the modern era, as women have gained greater political and social equality, the Cleopatra archetype continues to shape public perceptions. Female leaders are still judged by different standards than their male counterparts, still suspected of using feminine wiles rather than genuine competence, still reduced to symbols of either virtue or corruption, rather than being evaluated as complex political actors. But Cleopatra's legacy isn't just about the constraints placed on powerful women. It's also about the possibilities she revealed. Every woman who has claimed authority in her own right, who has refused to accept limitations based on gender, who has insisted on being judged by her actions rather than her appearance, is walking in pathways that Cleopatra first carved out. The scholarly renaissance that has transformed our understanding of Cleopatra over the past century reflects broader changes in how we approach both history and gender. As more women have entered the historical profession, as post-colonial perspectives have challenged Western-centric narratives, as archaeological evidence has provided alternatives to literary sources, a more complex and accurate picture of Cleopatra has emerged. This new Cleopatra is neither the seductress of Roman propaganda nor the tragic heroine of Renaissance drama, but something more interesting and more human, a brilliant politician who understood power in all its forms and used every tool at her disposal to protect her kingdom and her dynasty. She was ruthless when she needed to be, diplomatic when circumstances required it, and adaptable enough to survive in one of the most dangerous political environments in human history. The kingdoms she ruled, the alliances she forged, the children she raised, all of these were means to an end. The preservation of Egyptian independence and the continuation of a civilization that was already ancient when Rome was nothing more than a collection of mud huts on the Tiber. In this ultimate goal, she failed, but in the attempt, she demonstrated possibilities that continue to inspire and challenge us today. Perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra's story reveals the complex relationship between power and gender that continues to shape our world. She lived at a time when political authority was theoretically reserved for men, yet she managed to exercise it more effectively than most of her male contemporaries. She used every advantage available to her, including her sexuality, but never let herself be defined or limited by it. The weapons in her arsenal were intelligence, education, cultural sophistication, economic resources, diplomatic skill, and an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. These are the tools of soft power, the instruments of influence that work through persuasion rather than coercion. In an age that worshipped military might and political domination, she proved that there were other forms of strength, other paths to authority. The fact that she ultimately failed doesn't diminish the significance of what she achieved. The Roman Empire that defeated her was the greatest military machine in human history, backed by resources that dwarfed even Egypt's legendary wealth. That she managed to challenge it successfully for 2 decades. That she came within a hair's breadth of fundamentally altering the course of Western civilization. That she did all this while maintaining her independence and dignity makes her failure more heroic than most people's successes. As we reach the end of our journey through the marble halls of Alexandria and the blood-soaked waters of Actium, a question remains. What made Cleopatra so dangerous that her memory had to be systematically distorted for 2 millennia? Why did Augustus feel compelled to destroy not just her kingdom, but her reputation? Why did Roman historians, Christian chroniclers, and Renaissance writers all feel the need to transform her from a political genius into a beautiful seductress? The answer lies in what she represented. The possibility that the world could be organized differently, that power didn't have to flow from Rome, that civilization didn't require Roman law, Roman customs, Roman dominance, that a woman could rule as effectively as any man, that the East had as much to offer as the West, that synthesis might be superior to conquest. These were dangerous ideas in Augustus's Rome, where the entire political system was based on the assumption of Roman superiority and masculine authority. They remained dangerous ideas throughout the medieval period, when both secular and religious authorities depended on rigid hierarchies. They were still dangerous ideas during the Renaissance, when European powers were beginning their own imperial expansions based on assumptions of cultural supremacy. Only in the modern era, as we've begun to question these assumptions, have we been able to see Cleopatra clearly. And what we see is neither the monster of Roman propaganda nor the romantic heroine of literary tradition, but something more complex and more threatening to conventional ideas about power. A competent ruler who happened to be a woman. The competence is what made her dangerous. If Cleopatra had been nothing more than a beautiful face, if she had relied entirely on seduction and manipulation, she would have been easily defeated and quickly forgotten. But she wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages. She understood economics, diplomacy, military strategy, and cultural psychology. She could discuss philosophy with intellectuals, theology with priests, and tactics with generals. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world. And that's precisely what made her so threatening. Because if a woman could rule that effectively, if she could challenge Rome's greatest generals and nearly win, what did that say about all the assumptions that underlay ancient society? What did it suggest about the capabilities of women in general? What did it reveal about the arbitrary nature of the power structures that kept half of humanity subordinated? These questions were too dangerous to be asked directly so they were deflected through mythology. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale about the dangers of feminine beauty and foreign influence. Her political intelligence was rewritten as sexual manipulation. Her diplomatic successes were attributed to seduction rather than skill. Her 20-year reign was reduced to a series of romantic entanglements. But despite these distortions, despite centuries of propaganda and mythologizing, the truth about Cleopatra has survived. It survived in the monuments she built, the policies she implemented, the cultural syntheses she promoted. It survived in the grudging admiration of her enemies, the loyalty of her followers, the respect of neutral observers. Most importantly, it survived in the very intensity of the efforts to suppress it. Today, as we grapple with our own questions about power, gender, and cultural diversity, Cleopatra's example seems more relevant than ever. She showed us that intelligence and determination can triumph over circumstances, that cultural synthesis can be stronger than cultural dominance, that soft power can be more durable than military might, that a single individual, regardless of gender, can shape the course of history through will and wisdom. The woman who walked into that throne room in Alexandria 3 years before Caesar crossed the Rubicon was just another Ptolemaic princess, faced with the usual challenges of dynastic politics and imperial pressure. The woman who died in her golden mausoleum 30 years later had become something unprecedented, a figure so powerful that her enemies spent centuries trying to diminish her memory, so dangerous that her very existence challenged the foundations of the world order. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to Cleopatra's genius, that she remains dangerous even now, 2,000 years after her death. Dangerous to our assumptions about the past, dangerous to our prejudices about power, dangerous to our comfortable certainties about what women can and cannot achieve. She set out to preserve Egyptian independence and failed. But in failing, she preserved something more important: the knowledge that alternatives are always possible, that the world can be organized differently, that power takes many forms, and that the most dangerous weapon of all is a brilliant mind that refuses to accept limitations. The last active pharaoh of Egypt may have lost her kingdom, but she won immortality. And in the great game of history, that may be the most dangerous victory of all. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the ruins of Alexandria, we're left to contemplate a paradox that would have amused Cleopatra herself. The woman who lost everything, the queen whose kingdom was absorbed into a foreign empire, the ruler whose dynasty ended with her death, achieved a form of immortality that eluded most of history's greatest conquerors. Augustus ruled the Roman Empire for 45 years and died peacefully in his bed. But most people would struggle to name a single interesting thing about his personality. Caesar conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, but his fame rests largely on the manner of his death. Alexander the Great built an empire that stretched from Greece to India, but his legacy is mostly military. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for less than 2 decades and died by her own hand. But her story continues to fascinate us because it contains something that pure military or political achievement cannot provide: the eternal human struggle between ambition and circumstance, between dreams of what might be and the harsh realities of what is. She dreamed of an empire that would unite East and West through culture rather than conquest, through synthesis rather than domination. That dream died with her at Actium, but it didn't disappear. It lived on in the literature and art of the Roman Empire, in the syncretic religions that emerged from the fusion of Greek, Roman, and Eastern traditions, in the philosophical movements that sought wisdom from every available source. More broadly, it lived on in the idea that women could wield power as effectively as men, that intelligence was more valuable than brute force, that cultural sophistication was a form of strength rather than weakness. These ideas would be suppressed, distorted, and denied for centuries, but they never completely died. And whenever they re-emerged, whether in medieval courts or Renaissance salons or modern parliaments, they carried with them the memory of the Egyptian queen who had first proven their validity. Today, as we face our own challenges of globalization and cultural synthesis, as we grapple with questions of power and gender that would have been familiar to Cleopatra, her example seems more relevant than ever. She showed us that the most dangerous people aren't necessarily those with the biggest armies or the most money, but those with the clearest vision of alternative possibilities. The crown she wore has long since turned to dust. The kingdom she ruled has been conquered and reconquered dozens of times. The city she made, the center of the intellectual world, is now a provincial port. But the idea she represented, the possibility she embodied, the alternative she fought to preserve, these remain as powerful today as they were when she first walked into Caesar's quarters, wrapped in that legendary carpet. In the end, perhaps that's the real reason why Cleopatra was more dangerous than beautiful. Beauty fades, but ideas are immortal. Physical attraction can influence individuals, but vision can reshape civilizations. The woman who seduced Caesar and Antony has been dead for 2,000 years, but the queen who challenged Rome's assumptions about power and gender and cultural dominance continues to pose difficult questions that we're still trying to answer. She was dangerous not because she threatened any particular person or policy, but because she threatened the entire structure of assumptions that kept the ancient world stable. And in a sense, she's still dangerous today, still challenging us to think differently about power, still forcing us to question whether the way things are is the way things have to be. The last pharaoh of Egypt lost her kingdom, but won eternity. And that, perhaps more than any military victory or political triumph, is the mark of someone who was truly, genuinely, eternally dangerous. The serpent crown has crumbled. The golden throne sits empty. But the queen who wore both continues to rule, not over subjects who can be conquered, but over imaginations that can never be fully subdued. And that is a form of power that even Rome, in all its might and glory, could never quite understand or completely defeat. Good night, and remember, in the great game of history, the most dangerous players are often those who refuse to accept that the game is over.